Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives and those of our children. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I want to remind you quickly again that Charlie Fabian stands ready to get your suggestions, comments, reactions to our programs that can help us plan the future. You can reach Charlie best via email at charlie.info438@gmail.com. Once again, charlie.info438@gmail.com. Today's program is going to talk about unionization at Starbucks, a remarkable story. An even more remarkable story about a nurse fired by a hospital in ways that raise very fundamental issues. And finally, my commentary on Paul Krugman's telling us for the umpteenth time that the upcoming presidential election is about democracy. So let's jump right in. The story of Starbucks is becoming almost the poster child, if you like, of the unionization movement that is sweeping the United States. It begins with a single store, and there are thousands of Starbucks coffee shops across the country, as you all know. A single store in Buffalo, New York, in December of 2021, in other words, 2.5 years ago, decided they'd had it with the way they were treated at Starbucks, with the way they were paid or not at Starbucks, and so on. And so they decided to form a union to approach the employer there as a group, not individually anymore, to bargain, in a word, collectively. And they did so, and they formed the union to do so, now known as the Starbucks Workers United. Here we are 2.5 years later when that courageous group made and took the initiative to form a union. Now, over 435 Starbucks have unionized. That's an amazing statistic right there. There are therefore 10,500 Starbucks workers who are now unionized. Starbucks tried everything, hiring specialty anti-unionization law firms and so on. They had to file repeated complaints with the National Labor Relations Board, alleging that the company used illegal, unfair labor practices to try to stop or punish union efforts. When that didn't work, when the unionization efforts continued and were ever more successful, finally the corporation understood, as we now do, the strength of the unionization movement. And they stopped refusing to bargain with these newly unionized workers, and they have sat down now, and they are, as I talk to you, bargaining with this union. Two sides of the table working towards their first union contract. Here's some interesting things. There are 430 locals of this union, one in each of the Starbucks so far unionized. Each of them sends one person as a representative to the negotiating committee. That's right, a negotiating committee of 430 people. That's a democratic union. That's a union that wants the participation, welcomes, organizes, and institutionalizes democratic practices. Unions are on the move not only in the struggle with employers, but in the process of rebuilding a democratic union movement. It's a testimony not only to these people, but to the fact that in this country at this time, here is a movement to keep an eye on because it's growing and growing fast. My next story has to do with New York University Langone, one of the largest hospital medical centers in the city of New York and probably across the country. A few days ago, in the same day, they awarded a nurse who specializes in newborn baby medical issues. They awarded her an honor because she is so good at what she does. Later in the same day, they fired her. What's going on? They fired her because in her speech, if I recall correctly, her speech around the award she got, she mentioned that in her view, in Gaza, a genocide is going on. Because as a nurse for newborns, she understands very clearly what the risks are to the newborns in Gaza if they are being bombed and militarily attacked month after month for now half a year. They fired her, and I want to comment on that. Number one, New York University Langone can agree or disagree with the nurse. She has the freedom to articulate her opinion, and the hospital can develop procedures in which it articulates its position if it wishes to do that. But New York University Langone ought not to have the right to hire and fire a person because they have expressed a political point of view, and especially not when they've just finished giving her an award for doing her job in an outstanding way. In other words, it's crystal clear here that it's for her politics that she is being punished. And not just her, of course, whoever's dependent on her. Children, family, they are all going to suffer. NYU is using its extraordinary power to hire and fire, to punish someone for exercising their civil rights, to have free speech. You know, if the hospital were run as a worker co-op, democratically, one person, one vote, deciding on issues like hiring and firing and other important issues, this would never happen. The majority of workers would understand really well that you don't take a person's job unless they have really done something that is out of order in a way that democratic procedures can identify and take action on. A tiny number of people who administer a hospital should not, in a democratically organized institution, in a democratically organized economy, have the right to fire and hire by itself, and especially not be able to punish free speech. It's not difficult most of the time to distinguish free speech about a political policy, because that's what is going on in Gaza. Israel has a policy. It is acting on that policy. The United States is making a decision to support Israel in that case. These are all policy matters. The issue of whether what the Israelis are doing is a genocide or not is being discussed and decided in the United Nations right now as the nurse speaks. So it's clearly defined as a major policy issue that people have the right to speak freely about. You can distinguish that from attacking a group based on their religion or ethnicity or doing violence. We're not talking, those are different things and deserve different responses. This nurse is not accused by anyone of doing anything other than saying, in her opinion, what is going on in Gaza is a genocide. Shame on NYU and Langone. That is not only undemocratic, it's cruel, it's unjust, and fundamentally inappropriate for an institution like that to have done it. And it leads many of us to wonder whether what happened in the university happened at the hospital. Did a few big donors make angry calls to the head of the hospital, threatening to withdraw funding or not give what they had promised to give, etc., etc.? We know that happened with the universities. It became public. Did it happen with the hospital? Did they pander to that? Did they behave in this cruel, unjust, and undemocratic way for money? That would only make it all even worse. The third update I want to talk about in the time I have left in the first half of today's program has to do with a fellow economist, Paul Krugman. He has been writing repeatedly in recent months, but most starkly, I thought, in the column he wrote, published in the New York Times on the last day of May 2024. In other words, just a few days, weeks ago. In it, he's talking about the upcoming election, the presidential election, pitting Biden against Trump. And he wonders in his column, will this be, quote, the last election? With that kind of an alarming remark, he then goes into saying what he has said in other forums and for some time now, that what's going to be decided is democracy. It's become a kind of theme of folks like Paul Krugman, Democrats, liberals. We're going to be voting for or against democracy. And I want to respond to that theme. And I begin with a question. What democracy exactly are you talking about? I see the election. I know it's Trump and Biden. I'm generally aware with what they advocate, and I don't see them discussing democracy, even telling us what they think the word means, let alone what they might propose to do with it, about it, on it. And I do know something else. We don't have economic democracy. We may let one person have a vote and every person have a vote, but to say that we all have equal power over the election because each of us has one vote is naive to the point of idiocy. Some people have millions of dollars with which to influence candidates, influence policies, pay for lobbyists to work with the candidates who gets elected every day, all year round, which the mass of Americans don't have. So don't tell me we have one person, one vote in our political system. And it's even worse in our economic system. We cross the threshold into your factory, your office, your store, wherever you work. You know very well that a few people at the top make all the key decisions. You don't. You're an employee. You do what you're told. It's not a democratic system. It hasn't been. We haven't allowed democracy in the economic sphere, which means it rewards some people with a ton of money and others not. And they then use the money, those who get it, to shape the politics, making a bad joke out of the democracy for our politics. So, Mr. Krugman and others, our election is important. Our election will have effects. But the last one, the end of democracy, stop. Whatever it's the end of, democracy is not what that ending is about. Folks, I just want to remind you that donating to things like this is part of the relationship you have with us and we with you. No, we're not in crisis. No, we're not desperate. I'm very proud that we're not. A good number of you have been very kind over a long period of time in helping us. But I do want to, from time to time, not only appreciate that, but tell you that that's part of what we rely on to keep this process and this program going. So think about it, please, and know in advance, thank you. Welcome back, friends, to the second half of today's economic update. I want to devote this second half of the program to the relationship between the climate changes we're experiencing in the world and the movements to try to deal with that on the one hand, and with the particularities of the capitalist economic system that we live in on the other, because the two are intimately related. And that's what I want to go through, and I want to talk about how we could make the relationship between our economic system and our concerns about climate change work together for the betterment of the human race rather than to work at loggerheads, which is why we have the problems with climate change in the first place. So let me begin. Oil and gas, the fossil fuels that we burn to run our industries, that we burn to run our vehicles, and all the rest that you all know, are what they are in part because they have been, from the beginning, immensely profitable. They have drawn capital investments in oil and gas and so on, in large part because other sources of energy, coal, water power, the others that we knew of over the last century, were becoming problems, either in using them or in access to them, and oil and gas emerged as the most profitable at the time alternatives. Granted, much was not known. We might have learned over years the awful consequences of coal mining and coal burning and all of that, but we weren't quite clear at the beginning about what oil and gas burning might involve and might cost us. We became clear over time, although, as we know from the famous history of the Exxon Corporation, that the companies involved knew long ago what many of these problems were and kept it to themselves. Why? Because it was so profitable as the world became more and more dependent on oil and gas. And lest you think that that has changed, let me disabuse you. Oil and gas companies are among the most profitable in the whole capitalist system. Fighting over oil and gas is the story of the Middle East, is the story of Venezuela, of Nigeria, of the North Sea, of fill in the blank. New ways to get at oil and gas have caused wars in various parts of the world over real or prospective sources. Even in our own time, for example, there's no way to understand the Ukraine war without understanding that the most important weapon that the West, the United States and Western Europe in the main, had against Russia after Russia invaded Ukraine, the most important weapon were the sanctions, which were focused on, oil and gas. Europe no longer bought it from Russia. That was supposed to bankrupt Russia because they couldn't sell the oil and gas upon which their economy depended. And therefore, the idea was the war would be over quickly, the Russian ruble would collapse, the Russian economy with it, and Ukraine would emerge the victor. That was the plan. That was what President Biden, in effect, said, as did many other officials, both U.S. and European. That was the whole plan. And the fact that that plan failed is also a story of oil and gas. And simply put, it's because Russia found somewhere else to sell the oil and gas that they could no longer sell to Europe. And who? China and India, by and large, bought the oil and gas to fuel their economies, which are booming. They're the fastest growing economies in the world. India and China, the two most populous countries in the world. That's a virtually limitless market. So oil and gas is a central, profitable core of the capitalist economic system. The cheap energy you can get from oil and gas was also crucial in developing all sorts of other industries. I'll simply mention one or two. The automobile, unthinkable without the ability to be fueled by petroleum, refined petroleum or gasoline. And that's been the automobile industry until very recently, when the electric automobile begins to change all of that. And these things always change, but oil and gas have been central. So what's the problem with all of that? Well, the problem is, as so often happens, that there are side effects which turn out to be momentously important, but that the capitalist system doesn't count them. And therefore, what is profitable for the capitalists who invent in finding the oil and bringing the oil to the surface, and then refining the oil into all the other products that could be profitably made with cheap oil. I'm talking here not only about gasoline, but about the plastics industry, the fertilizer industry, and so on. So the whole profit system of capitalism rests, and has now for nearly a century, on cheap oil and gas. Okay. Here are some of the consequences that are not measured in the profit calculations of the companies that found it, brought it to the surface, refined it, and made all other kinds of products with it. Migration. I picked that one first because there's so much controversy in the world about the vast migrations, particularly from the global south to the global north, but other kinds as well. Much of that is a consequence of the importance of oil and gas. Now, nobody worries about it. The profits in the oil and gas business were not used to ease the problem of people so they wouldn't have to migrate, or to help them in the migrating process to have far better outcomes. Instead, we allowed the migrations to go and the people involved to suffer beyond words of what I could go through from this. That really should have been counted before you committed, as we have as a culture, to oil and gas. Deaths. Tens of millions of people have died from the consequences of oil and gas as our fuel. They died in car accidents. They died from air pollution, water pollution, on and on. There's no end to this. Where are they counted? Answer: nowhere. And the very cheapness of oil and gas operated in another way. It slowed down, and often it stopped the efforts human beings could have made and eventually did make to find alternatives. Solar energy, the oceans, water energy, all kinds of things. Some were adaptations of things we knew as a species long ago, and others were urgently searched for because people became aware of the terrible cost of oil and gas. So here we have it. We kind of know the problem, if we're honest. On the one hand, there's the call of the profit motive, driving people to invest huge amounts of money, to go to work, to do everything necessary to find the oil and gas, to bring it to the surface, to refine it, and to develop it. It's profitable, so it happens. And then there's now a movement been going on at least as far back as Rachel Carson's famous article, where we understand that the costs of this energy are stupendous, and that if we could find energy, solar and other kinds, that didn't have these side effects, like solar doesn't, we would be much better off, able to do many of the things we learned to do with oil and gas without the horrible side effects of the illnesses we all have in us, of the deaths of people around us, and all the rest. Well, then, what's the problem? The problem is that the people who make profits off of oil and gas use their profits to keep those profits coming. So they buy the politicians not to look for alternatives, not to subsidize the search for alternatives, not to move the society in the directions of much safer, much better uses of energy, and to use the energy we do get much more efficiently than we now do. And we already know how to do it, but the effort, the momentum, the money needed to change society in that direction isn't there. And finally, there's the hesitance of the population, which the profiteering oil and gas companies use. Where's the hesitation? Well, the oldest game in the book. You threaten people by saying, if we don't have oil and gas, if we don't use oil and gas, well, then you'll lose your job. We won't have all the things that come from oil and gas, and then you will live in a difficult life. You won't have a job. Telling auto workers, for example, if we don't have gasoline and oil, well, then there won't be a market for cars, and you won't have your job, or for General Motors or Ford or anybody else. Well, I want to pick on that one because it's so often heard. Here's the fear. The corporations are fearful that doing away with oil and gas will kill their profits. German industry is discovering that right now. Because they chose to sanction Russia by not buying oil and gas, Germany has to pay much more money for alternative energy, such as liquefied natural gas from the United States, and they're not the powerhouse of Europe anymore. And German industry is leaving the country to go where the energy is still cheap. They're paying a heavy price. Nobody else in that business wants to pay that price. So the people who make a lot of money off of oil and gas use that money to be able to keep making a lot of money off of oil and gas. And they go to the working class and they say, you better stay with us, otherwise you'll lose your job. Well, here's the answer when anybody tells you you can't do something because if you hurt the profits of a company, then the jobs will disappear. Those two things are not linked that way. If we have a commitment to get rid of oil and gas on grounds of our health and the better off we would be as a people, let's do that. If we're concerned to give people jobs, let's do that. They are not either or. We can do both. Imagine an agency in this country. If we decide to change an industry, to go from private automobiles to collective, like we do with bicycles here in New York City. You don't need your own bicycle. There are bicycles everywhere. It's become a collective consumer good. We can say we will put people to work. If you lose your job in any industry, we will continue your income and give you incentives to choose areas where we are growing as a society, and you will go to work there. You don't have to worry about your job. You don't have to confuse what the employer says, stay with it because I make my profits. You don't have to feel that that's also your job that's at stake. As a society, we can make a commitment to you that your job will never be at stake. We have useful things to do, and you will have a job doing them. You don't have. You can make a decision to get rid of oil and gas and shift to solar because you're better off that way and it won't jeopardize your job at all. What do we call a system that does that? There's a simple answer: socialism. We've come to the end of today's program. I want to thank you for your attention, your participation, and as always, I look forward to speaking with you again next week.